Hi, I'm Christine On, the Executive Director of Women Cross DMZ, one of 3 women's peace organizations that make up the transnational feminist campaign, Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End the War. Together with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, which is a coalition of South Korean women's peace organizations, the Korea Peace Now campaign advocates for a formal end to the Korean War with a peace agreement and women's inclusion in the peace process. We put together this report in order to comprehensively address all the concerns, misconceptions, and myths about a peace-first process, as well as why women's involvement is so crucial. As you will hear from some of the authors shortly, we believe ending the Korean War with a peace agreement is the most realistic and effective option for achieving goals such as denuclearization. Each speaker will give a very brief presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please keep yourself on mute at all times unless you are called on to speak. If you have a question, please type in STACK in the chat function and someone will call on you. Then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Please identify yourself and your news organization first. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Charles Hanley was a reporter for the Associated Press for over 40 years. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner and co-author of the book, The Bridge at Nogunri, with Choi Sang-hoon and Martha Mendoza. He's the author of a new narrative history of the Korean War titled Ghost Flames, Life and Death in Hidden War. We're so honored that he could join us today. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you, Christine, and I'm very pleased to be able to join you today, and welcome to everyone. All wars are a result of human failure, and in the case of Korea, the approximate failure was that of the United States and the Soviet Union in failing to reunify the artificially divided peninsula in the late 1940s. The war that resulted was as merciless and total as any in modern times. Perhaps 4 million people were killed, at least half of them innocent civilians, both North and South. As one South Korean soldier reflected in his memoir, millions of people killed, but nothing has changed except for the destruction of human lives and their dreams. Those were soldier Hur Won-mu's thoughts on July 27, 1953, when the armistice was signed at Panmunjom. An armistice is not a peace. The word descends from Latin and it means the armies have come to a standstill. They're holding their fire, but they still face each other as belligerents, as enemies, ready to respond to provocation, ready to take this war off hold. To end that tense and tentative situation, the armistice envisioned a political conference to, quote, settle through negotiation the questions of the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Korea, the peaceful settlement of the Korea question, etc. That etc. must be the most fraught in diplomatic history. The two sides did convene a conference, a political conference at Geneva in 1954, only to fail again. And failure has stalked the Korea question over and over in the decades since. Now we have a clear, detailed, persuasive report from experts dedicated to ending the failures by following a basic principle: peace now, peace first. A process toward peace, a peace agreement unencumbered by preconditions, ideology, sweeping demands for change. A clean agreement recognizing first and foremost that the wartime right to the use of force has ended at last. Path to Peace argues that such a peace, under which powerful armies would no longer stand by, but stand down and stand back, would reduce nuclear tensions, facilitate discussions on arms control and human rights in Korea, and improve ordinary people's lives through the easing of economic sanctions and the reduction of crushing military spending. And it argues convincingly that the greater the involvement of women in the process, the greater the chance for success. Here with us now, as Christine said, are some of the authors of the report. Henri Ferron, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy, who will begin shortly by briefly addressing the legal context and human rights. Catherine Killow, Advocacy and Leadership Coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, who will speak on denuclearization. Hyun Lee, National Organizer for Women Cross DMZ, who will deal with the US-South Korean Alliance. And finally, Youngmi Cho, Executive Director of the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, on the role of women in achieving a peace. And now, Henri.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's an honor to be here today and to be able to present this work. Thank you for being here. So anybody approaching the question of Korea has to find their own answer to the question of why it's taking so long for the two Koreas and the United States to agree to peace. What I can tell you is that from a legal perspective, it is absurd. A peace agreement can be concluded anytime, any day without preconditions. It need not be a complicated document. Most legal issues like borders and prisoner exchanges have already been addressed in the armistice. All it takes now is for all sides to recognize that the wartime rights to use force have ended. In this sense, a peace agreement is an essential demonstration of clarity and sincerity. Any ambiguity about the intentions to use force is a pointless and unacceptably dangerous security risk. This is a nuclear standoff in which one wrong move could quickly lead to millions of casualties. And for a country to refuse a peace agreement in this configuration signals that it reserves the right to use force. And that doesn't lead to anything good, because ambiguity is just driving all sides to assume the worst and pour billions into more weapons to be better prepared when it hits. That's also why a peace agreement should come at the beginning of the resolution process. This is a standoff in which no side is ready to surrender or to lay down arms first. The only way to de-escalate is for all sides to agree not to use violence in the resolution of the dispute, and every side benefits from that. It reduces tensions and it creates space for discussing further steps to de-escalation. By contrast, asking for one side to disarm first is not a peace offer. It is a demand of surrender and it will escalate tensions. Now, it's essential that the United States participate in a peace agreement, given its past and present military involvement in Korea. The two Koreas have called for a peace agreement and have called for it to be in talks with the United States. Contrary to common belief, there are no legal obstacles to US participation. The US was directly involved in armed conflict with North Korea, and that gives it the capacity to conclude peace. Its participation is merely a question of political will. Ending the war will also sap the militaristic policies that are a key driver of human suffering on the Korean Peninsula. The war does not just threaten all peoples involved with death and destruction. It has also kept alive harsh national security laws and has meant that billions of dollars are taken from welfare budgets and diverted to military ones. Every dollar spent on weapons is a dollar that can't be spent on food or healthcare. Pressure, sanctions, war. The key to improving the human rights situation is peace. Thank you. You're muted, Charles.
Thank you, Henri. And now Catherine Killow, please.
Great. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Henri. I'm going to present on a question that's most likely on the top of all your minds, which is the question of what a peace agreement means for the nuclear dispute. This report offers a really new framework for resolving the security crisis. That is by really getting to the core of the nuclear dispute. That is the unresolved Korean War. For a lot of people, the concept of a peace agreement occurring before North Korea denuclearizes raises a lot of questions that I'm going to try to preempt here, such as, wouldn't that legitimize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state? Or what would North Korea have to give up for the US to sign a peace agreement? What this report finds is that a peace agreement, first of all, it would not legally imply recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, but nor should concluding a peace agreement before North Korea completely denuclearizes be considered a reward for bad behavior. Rather, and this is the big takeaway, a peace agreement that ends the wartime status quo and actually allows for US-North Korea relations to transform into one where we can actually engage with one another, not as enemies, but on more normal diplomatic terms, would improve the conditions for negotiating a nuclear deal. Unfortunately, we've seen administration after administration pursue pressure-based denuclearization efforts, and that has come at the cost of a growing and catastrophic nuclear war. I think we need only remember the terrifying fire and fury period of 2017. I like to remind people of a quote from the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, at the height of that crisis, in which he said, "We must stop a situation where North Korea miscalculates and threatens us with nuclear weapons, or where the United States considers a preemptive strike." I like that quote because I think it's a great reflection of the mutual security crisis that our countries face. And it's an important lens that this report takes. What we understand as the nuclear crisis today is really informed by this ongoing war. So that is to say, the nuclear crisis has been present with us from the day that President Truman, at the outbreak of the Korean War, acknowledged the possibility of using atomic weapons. And unfortunately, things have not gotten better. They've only gotten worse, which is why this report really emphasizes that, at a minimum, addressing the nuclear crisis requires that there are security commitments on the side of the US. And we believe that that can begin with a formal end to the Korean War and a peace agreement. So I will stop there and happy to answer questions that get into more detail about denuclearization in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And now Hyun Lee.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning. Another question that we often get when we talk about a peace agreement is what would happen to the US-ROK alliance and US troops in South Korea. So I have a two-part answer to this question. So one, strictly speaking about the legal implications of a peace agreement, actually it wouldn't affect the US-South Korea alliance or US troops in Korea, because those are bilateral arrangements between the US and South Korea. Having said that, though, the more important question for us is, should the US-South Korea relationship be a military alliance forever? And we argue in the report that a peace agreement would create peaceful conditions that would allow the US and South Korea to reset their relationship from one that is right now primarily a military alliance to a new type of partnership that promotes peace on the peninsula and in the region. So let's go back to the historical origin of the alliance. As you know, it was born out of the armistice situation, which is an unnatural state that was only meant to be temporary. In fact, the armistice agreement, as many of you know, recommended that within 90 days of its signing, there should be a political conference to discuss a permanent settlement of the war. But we have had, to this day, tens of thousands of troops on both sides, constantly in a state of readiness for war, And that's been going on every day for almost 70 years. And this, we don't think, is normal. All sides pour billions of dollars into a perpetual arms race that are about the destruction of the other side. And people are constantly living in fear of war, potentially nuclear war. The situation has also put a strain on the US-South Korea relationship. For one, there has been an ongoing debate about who should pay for US troops in Korea. And this is a debate that may ease up a little bit with the new administration, but it will nonetheless continue to be a source of tension between the two countries. Also, the US still has wartime operational control over South Korean forces. What this means is that if there's a war in Korea, a US general would command South Korean forces. And this is bad for both sides because for the US, we would automatically be pulled into the war, even if the outbreak of the war was accidental or unintended. For South Korea, it doesn't have full sovereignty without control over its own armed forces. And this has been a sore point between the two countries. So what we're saying is, let's end this abnormal, outdated armistice situation, and replacing the armistice with a peace agreement is the best way to do that. And that would actually benefit the US-South Korea relationship because you create peaceful conditions and the two countries can move from a military alliance to a new partnership that promotes peace on the peninsula and also in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyun. And now we'll turn to Youngmi Cho in Korea. Youngmi?
Yes, thank you, Charles. It's an honor to be here today. I would like to tell you about how war and division have affected women and why women's participation in the peace process is so important. So women have a particular stake in resolving the Korean War due to the gendered impact of war and militarism. The Korean women have faced some of the highest costs of this 70 years conflict. Actually, before the war, until the end of the World War II, Korean women were sexually enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army. And during the war, women couldn't have a normal family life. Women were responsible for finding food and shelter. And after the war and with the mass stationing of US troops in South Korea, the system of military prostitution established under the Japanese rules continued. The South Korean and US government used the women in Camp Town to strengthen military alliance and fuel the South Korean economy, yet were stigmatized and silenced. And South Korea and North Korea have become a highly militarized society. And also in North Korea, widespread sanctions impacts women economically, socially, and physically. And sanctions cause delay in the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid. Actually, for decades, women on the peninsula and internationally have mobilized to end the Korean War through grassroots actions. Despite a rich history of organizing through grassroots action on the peninsula and internationally, only very few have been invited to formal peace-building initiatives. Several sources of international law, including the Women, Peace and Security Frameworks, mandate women's inclusion. The research shows the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups will continue to more durable peace. For the Korea peace process to be successful, the women must be involved. Women must be at the table. So we urge all parties involved in the peace process to ensure the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women and civil society groups. We have several recommendations in our report. I will talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youngmi. And now we will move on to a Q&A period. And as Christine explained, if you have a question, please go to the chat box, bottom toolbar, and type in the word stack, S-T-A-C-K. And I would ask a favor that if you're Korean, please transliterate the Hangul into Roman letters, into English, so to speak, so that I can, the moderator can call on you appropriately. But I will invoke the moderator's privilege at this point and ask the first couple of questions. And the first I want to make very topical and direct it to Catherine Killow. Judging from the background and the statements and the appointments of the new Biden administration, do you see a good possibility of a change, of a significant change in the official US position on a Korea peace?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Charles. Secretary of State Blinken did say that there would be a full review of North Korea policy, so it might still be too early to tell, but I'm going to offer some thoughts on what we do know. There have been several key appointments of officials who have past experience on North Korea in previous administrations, from Clinton to Obama, which is good insofar as they are skilled diplomacy hands and know this issue. I think what we're still waiting to see, and we don't want to see, is a return to the strategic patience era of the Obama administration, which didn't work. But we also don't want to see a complete dismissal of the Trump administration's better instincts, of which there were not many, but I think the direct leader-to-leader engagement is something that clearly progressed U.S.-North Korean relations and unfortunately was not able to be sustained, but that's something that we would hope to see with this new administration. I would also, just to add on a positive note, I was pleased to see that Kurt Campbell, who is Biden's senior official for Asia policy, he did acknowledge the need to avoid repeating the Obama administration's early indecision. And he also recognized value in Trump's symmetry with Kim Jong-un. So I really hope that those lessons learned will factor into their policy review. But yeah, that's what I anticipate or hope to anticipate.
Very good. Thank you very much. And now my second question, I'll direct to Henri Ferron. Henri, do you envision a lifting of the whole complex of economic sanctions with a peace agreement, even without a change in the nuclear situation? Thank you.
So that's a very good question, and one that we grappled with a lot. I'd say that the first priority in Korea should be to prevent nuclear war. And a peace agreement is a document in itself about the use of force. It's a question that's legally distinct from the issue of nuclear weapons, insofar as North Korea considers it has as much of a right to have nuclear weapons as other nuclear armed countries. The Security Council disagrees and sanctions North Korea for it. And that is a question that will have to be addressed. But if it can be addressed in a peace agreement, that would be great. It should not hold back a peace agreement. And it will have to be addressed at some point, because sanctions in a sense have been not only ineffective, maximum pressure has not pushed North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons. It's also been counterproductive insofar as it has reinforced the militaristic logic that I was talking about before. And third problem of sanctions is that they cross numerous moral and legal lines. Sanction used to be meant to be smart, only targets the elite and the military, but we are way past that. Right now, the logic of sanctions is to take the people hostage for the policies of a government that they have little to no control over. And there should be a examination of the way sanctions are used. it should not come at the cost of delaying a peace agreement.
Very good. Thank you, Henri. Now, I see Tim Shurock is on board with a question, and
I am.
there he is.
Thank you, Charles. Actually, my question was close to what Charles asked, but my concern about the Obama administration, from what I've been seeing of the key appointments, is what I consider to be a very kind of pro-Japan bent of these people, particularly Kurt Campbell, who's known as, very close to LDP in Japan, and has, during the Obama administration, was played a very direct role in pressuring the only progressive Japanese prime minister they've had about troops in Okinawa, and his desire to reorient the US-Japan military relationship. I think people like Kurt Campbell and Tony Blinken and Avril Haines view South Korea as a secondary partner, with the US and Japan being the primary parts of the alliance. And I think that is sort of an unseen, not very much mentioned part of US policy in Korea, but it certainly diminishes the influence of South Korea and the ROK in the Moon administration. And I'll just end by saying, the first Asian prime minister that Biden called, or the first leader he called, was Suga of Japan, and he did not call President Moon as yet. I mean, a Hankyoreh newspaper noted this 2 days ago. So that's my question: is that what about the primacy of Japan and a lot of U.S. policy toward Korea, and how could your push for a peace agreement, how would that work out?
Well, and Catherine, would you like to take that on?
It's a good question, Tim. Maybe I'm a little more optimistic, but you've been following this issue a bit longer. Actually, I feel like Hyun may be better equipped to answer this question because she's been thinking through the future of US-ROK relations. Is it okay if I pass it to you, Hyun?
Sure. I totally agree with you, Tim. I share your concerns. If we look at President Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific policy or strategy, that's been the approach, prioritizing the alliance with Japan, and also trying to get South Korea to join the trilateral alliance, push forward missile defense cooperation, this type of thing. So, I am worried that the new administration's policy will reinforce Cold War divisions in the region. I'm also worried that Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said in recent past that the US should squeeze North Korea and cut off its access to resources to get it to the negotiating table. On the other hand, at North Korea's Workers' Party Congress last month, Kim Jong-un said they will continue to develop their nuclear weapons capability unless there's a fundamental change in US policy. So I think what this means then is that the stage is set for another nuclear standoff. And it is not a question of if, it's a question of when. But we are in 2021 when the whole world is grappling with the pandemic, climate change, rise of ultranationalism. We cannot afford another crisis like the nuclear brinksmanship that we saw back in 2017. So what we're saying is to President Biden, his theme is build back better. Well, the best thing his administration can do to build back better on the Korean Peninsula and also reduce the threat of a nuclear war with North Korea is to end the Korean War with a peace agreement.
Very good. Thank you, Hyun and Catherine. And I see Andrew Salmon is on board. He has typed out the question, but can he be brought in to pose it? Or shall I read Andrew's question?
Go ahead if you like, Charles. It's right in front of you.
Okay, fine. And it's a very basic and very good question, and I had it in mind myself. Ending the Korean War seems a low energy, low risk move for the US to initiate. Why do you think it has not been addressed for over 7 decades by previous administrations? Contrarily, even if there was a peace agreement, there would still be 2 armies, 2 systems, 2 Koreas, and 1 DMZ. There would also still be nuclear weapons in both sides' armories. So realistically, would a peace agreement, in essence, a piece of paper, make any difference in the overall situation on the peninsula? And so it's really a double question. Why has it taken so long to address this situation? And would it really make a difference? And who would like to take that one on?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Well, I started my presentation saying that it was really quite absurd. So I'm not sure I have a crystal ball here. One thing that can be noted is that, of course, there was a very different dynamic during the Cold War, where especially the military dictatorships in South Korea saw a certain interest also in avoiding the question of a peace agreement. That said, what the question of why it has stayed unresolved today, I think, has a lot to do with myths that have accumulated over the years. A lot of people of good faith looking at the issue and having trouble with certain, notably legal arguments about whether it's even the role of the United States to be involved in a peace agreement, or whether the armistice is enough. And one reason that we wrote out the report is to clarify, give a one-stop shop to address all of these issues, to really make clear and to take apart those myths about, oh, there must be some legal reasons that a peace agreement won't work. Take it apart and show really that it is purely a question of political will. And in that sense, what, in my view, has been holding back this political will is waiting to see whether North Korea would at some point collapse. And that has been what has driven US policy up to very recently as well, through trying true maximum pressure to put North Korea on its knees and to get it to surrender, basically. And if even maximum pressure has not been able to get through, I think what the clear lesson of these past years, but also past decades since the 1990s, of efforts to try to denuclearize North Korea, is that now the situation has come to such a dangerous point where one must first agree not to use force because it's become explosive. It's a tinderbox. So yeah, I hope this answers your question.
If I may add to that, Charles, I think what we're saying is that a peace agreement should be the first step in building towards a peace regime, which in my mind would involve arms reduction by all parties. So the peace agreement is not an end all, but it is an agreement that allows all parties to say, we will start to draw down arms because we are ending the 70-year-old conflict. And that would actually create the conditions for the 2 Koreas to determine for themselves if they want to reunify or if they want to peacefully coexist, but that should be determined by the Korean people themselves. And then on the question of the nuclear weapons, we should move towards global disarmament. Everybody, all parties should sign on to the nuclear ban treaty. But first, we need a peace agreement to agree that we are ending the conflict so that everybody can start to draw down their arms.
If I might also chime in too, Charles, sorry, I know I'm just the introducer here, but as Hyun noted about the peace regime that would be set forth with a formal end and resolution to the Korean War, that would set forth a diplomatic process towards normalization, which we hope would include liaison offices in Pyongyang, in Washington, D.C., and that would begin the process of long-awaited family reunions. I mean, there are over 200,000 Korean Americans with families in North Korea. There are still families of American POW, MIA soldiers who are still waiting to have closure of what happened to their fathers who fought. As you note, in your book, Charles, there are many, many victims and unresolved traumas from this war. And I think that when we maintain the posture that the status quo is okay and that it is normal, that we allow this war to continue unabated. And so I do believe that this peace first approach is revolutionary, and it's what the moment is calling for. And I'm heartened to have heard Tony Blinken note that today in his interview with Andrew Mitchell that successive administrations have failed to solve the North Korean problem. I am a little disheartened by his knee-jerk recommendation of more sanctions as part of that, when we know that pressure-based tactics have totally failed. And what we are in is in a historic moment where you have a Democratic administration, you have a Democratic-controlled Congress, you have a Democratic administration in South Korea, and you have the desire of both American and Koreans who want a formal end to the Korean War. There's tons of polls that show that the majority of Americans want a formal end to the war. There are many polls that show that Americans want an end to America's endless wars and to pursue diplomacy in resolving conflicts with enemies like North Korea. And now we have a House resolution in Congress, House Resolution 152, that calls for a formal end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. And now there are more and more voices in Congress that agree with us that it is time to wrap up this war. So I wanted to bring in these multiple perspectives because everybody gains when we get to peace.
Very good. Thank you all. And I will pose another question of my own, and perhaps Hyun Lee, you'd like to take this on, and it's about China. Of course, China was a belligerent and was a signatory to the armistice. What do you think China's attitude would be toward this idea of working toward a clean peace without nuclear concessions? Do you think they would want to participate in the peace negotiations that you envision? And do you think that would be helpful or not?
So China's participation in the peace process is not necessary because it has already normalized relationships with the US and South Korea. But it may be politically useful because China is North Korea's allies, and it also has a very central role in the security politics in the region. We should note that all three parties, North Korea, South Korea, China, they have all expressed willingness already to replace the armistice with a peace agreement. In 2018, in Panmunjom, Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, they agreed to do that. And China has expressed support for it. The key missing party is the United States.
Mm-hmm. Very, very good. If we could turn back to the nuclear question, perhaps Henri, you could explain what seems to be the thinking, the view of what denuclearization in Korea would amount to. How narrow and how broad an idea would this be, aside from the idea of a clean peace agreement without negotiating the nuclear issue, but long term, what is your impression of what would be required under this rubric of denuclearization?
Yes. So again, the denuclearization, it makes little sense to pursue it through means that risk nuclear wars. That's why we believe that the peace agreement still needs to be the first step. Beyond that, the question that we're facing on denuclearization, as I was mentioning before, is that North Korea is a country that considers that it has as much of a right to nuclear weapons as other nuclear weapon states. And it considers that these weapons are its ticket to survival. Now, from the perspective of the Security Council, from the perspective of the United States, the approach has been to put pressure on North Korea to make it change its mind on that, to try to impress upon it that it would be less safe with nuclear weapons than without. It is an approach that has failed, and that we have seen repeatedly fail. What we can draw as a conclusion is that what is needed is a change in the security environment, really. And the key to that is peace. For denuclearization to occur, if there is any chance of it occurring, there has to be an approach that bases then on stabilizing the security environment, that bases on reciprocity, on positive incentives. In that context, I believe arms control is possible. And what should be driving the thinking about this is, of course, the global abolition of nuclear weapons, because these are weapons that are impossible to use without basically committing mass murder. So hopefully we will get to a point where tensions are reduced enough that we can get all countries to sign on to the nuclear ban treaty.
Very good. Thank you. The subject of the U.S. troops in South Korea has been raised, but let me put it this way, and perhaps Hyun, you could take this on. What about this continued presence of U.S. troops under the peace you envision? Would North Korea demand their removal, do you believe? And if so, would South Korea agree to that? And if not a full removal, perhaps some change in the U.S. military presence and role in South Korea could be a result of a peace deal.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I will answer it with a question, which is, what makes all of us truly secure? You know, we spend close to $1 trillion every year on military and defense. Does it make us safer? We face multiple crises today that cannot be resolved militarily. So, you know, many people have been saying for a long time, we need to shift our priorities from war to human needs, and it's more urgent now. And what we're saying is a peace agreement should move us towards establishing a peace regime. And I think this means it should include the reduction of US troops, certainly an end to the offensive posture that has been institutionalized over the past 7 years. So for example, an end to operation plans that envision the collapse or occupation of North Korea. In addition, South Korea has raised some very valid concerns in the recent past about being caught in the crosshairs of a US conflict in the region, just by virtue of being a host for US bases. And South Korea should not forever be a garrison of the United States. And the last thing I'll just say is that peace begets peace. And I hope that peace on the Korean Peninsula will have a domino effect in the entire region, and lead to greater cooperation for peace in the broader region. And I think that would be a net gain for everybody.
Very good, thank you. I think we can, well, you know, I have a sort of a practical, ignorant question, let's say, and that is, as we know, the US and South Korean coalition fought the Korean War under the UN flag, citing UN Security Council resolutions. Would the United Nations have a role? Is there some legal requirement for the UN to be involved in a peace negotiation? Who would like to take that on?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So the starting point of that question, of course, are the Security Council resolutions that allowed the US to intervene in the course of 1950 at the North Korean attack of June 1950. What must be clear is that the resolution allowed helping South Korea to push back the North Korean forces up to the border. And that was done by September 1950. The other part of that resolution was to restore peace and security, but well, 70 years of war hasn't exactly been peace and security. So what I'm saying really is that that resolution really has very little basis to stand upon today. What's also important to note is that during combat operations, it was the United States that commanded the United Nations command, and it didn't consult with the Security Council on a regular basis for the very good reason that the Soviet Union was on that council. And so the United States, in that sense, was a participant in its own right in the Korean War. For the United Nations to play a role today is something that would, of course, be welcomed from the perspective of the Department of Political Affairs, who's done a very important job trying to get all parties to talk to each other. But a role of, say, the Security Council or any other instance of the United Nations per se is not legally required. And there are several secretary generals have also made clear that the United Nations command was the responsibility of the United States and not of the United Nations.
Very good, very good. You know, we have a question from John Power of the South China Morning Post. And he writes that, I was wondering if you'd be happy to offer any reaction to the latest UN Human Rights Report on North Korea, which suggests the terrible conditions identified in the 2014 report persist. What do you think of the report? Does it ring true? And forgive me, I'm just scrolling here. Is there any sign of improvement at all? Or is the situation as bad as ever? What, if anything, can the world do about it? Who would like to address that?
I'm happy to take that one too. So, I mean, on human rights, what we have seen is, of course, this effort since 2014 to have a commission of inquiry look into specifically the North Korean situation and rely on what one calls a naming and shaming approach in order to try to get to some sort of improvement. What we have seen over the last 6 years, of course, is that pressure has not changed anything. On the contrary, it's been interpreted in Pyongyang as the emanation of a hostile policy, which has reinforced the militaristic logic that I was talking about before. Insofar as the government focuses more on national security in those instances, reacts harshly. And the only way that we get out of this vicious circle, really, and the only way that we get to results is to stabilize the security situation and remove the justifications for these militaristic policies. If one looks at the way in which North Korea addresses human rights critiques in its own self-evaluations to the United Nations, it will systematically point out that the war and the sanctions that are its greatest challenge to the improvement of the human rights situation. And so we don't really get anywhere by shouting at North Korea that it is doing a bad job. The situation is terrible, but it has been for a long time, and the war itself has been a key driver of that suffering. And so we need to end the war in order to be able to get to significant changes in the human rights situation.
Very good. Thank you, Henri. And Tim Shorrock has another very good question.
Thank you.
A basic question. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, my question is also on North Korea. I was reading a recent interview with Jung Park, who's going to be the newest Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, I guess, on Korea affairs. Who's been pretty much quite hawkish. But one thing I noted in something she wrote recently was she claims that in Hanoi, when this deal broke down between Trump and Kim Jong-un, that Kim Jong-un also rejected the idea of liaison offices. He wanted to have sanctions lifted, and Bolton and Trump would not make any move on that at all. But I guess her point was like, well, he was offered liaison offices, and he rejected that too. So that would be an important step. But I mean, I'm sort of wondering what you think would be initial steps that they would accept, as steps toward a peace agreement. Like, do you think they would be interested in, like, if Biden said, okay, we're still going to do this, we want you to denuclearize, but we're willing to, like, take a step of having liaison offices and at least starting this sort of a diplomatic process. Do you think that would be an initial step that they would accept? I think it's mostly, that could be directed at Christine, but Hyun, I don't know.
Yeah, I can take that. Well, I don't think any of us here speak for the DPRK, so
Right.
I don't know that we can say for sure. But I think it is important for us to, go back in history and note, what the DPRK has actually said about what it wants, right? So let's go back to right after the war in 1954. There was actually a conference in Geneva to discuss the future of Korea. And according to a declassified report by the US delegation to that conference, the North Koreans at this conference said, the principal task is achieving Korean unity by converting the armistice into lasting peaceful reunification. And they wanted an agreement on all Korea elections to establish a government representing the whole country. Unfortunately, that conference ended without an agreement on Korea, mainly in large part due to US opposition to this proposal. And it's been like that, for the past 70 years. In past negotiations, consistently, whether we're talking about the 1994 agreed framework or the joint communique or the six-party talks or the Singapore agreement, consistently North Korea has raised 3 points, which is move towards a peace regime, establish lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, 2, normalize relations, 3, denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So I think as the Biden administration does a review process of its Korea policy and comes up with its own policy on North Korea, they should go back to those past agreements that the US has signed and really understand what is the relationship between those 3 things. And the era of, will you give up Yangbyeon in exchange for sanctions relief? I think that's over now. We had an opportunity 2 years ago, we blew it. And now I think we need to start anew. And I think we need to go back fundamentally, what will resolve this conflict?
Very good, thank you, Hyun. I have a question, I think for Young-mi Cho, in Korea. If we're speaking about the role of women in the peace process, I'm just curious what her impression is, what she can tell us about the comparison, the contrast, if there is one, between the DPRK and the ROK as far as the involvement of women in these broader political processes. Does she see a greater willingness on one side or the other to involve more women in the discussions?
네, 질문 감사합니다.
Thank you for your question. First of all, we have not spoken closely with the women in North Korea. However, we understand that there are plenty of frameworks settled by the United Nations, and it clearly mandates encouraging involvement of women participation in peace process. And also we understand that North Korea has been working on improving the participation of women. And so that's why we can see the improvement in the process. But however, I think South Korea has been a little bit more like a conservative on this issue. So you understand that there is like international convention against discrimination against the women, and we also have other women-oriented treaties and agreements internationally, and I expect like both from North and South Korea, so that more women have a chance to participate in peace process.
Very good, thank you very much. I'm looking to see whether we have.
Charles, I think there's one last question from a Oh My News reporter.
And I don't see it, but do you?
Yeah, shall I go ahead and read it, or?
Please.
Okay, it's William Perry said, quote, "The United States should support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons." This being former Secretary of Defense under Clinton. The United States signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. At the Reykjavik Summit in 1986, President Reagan made the case for eliminating these weapons. And in 2009, President Obama pledged that the US would seek, quote, "seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons," end quote. Now in 2021, a treaty has come into force that makes nuclear weapons illegal for all who sign it, end quote. That was a quote from Bill Perry. What do you think? Should North Korea sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty again? And I think that should go to Catherine.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. And shout out to Secretary William Perry, who has been a really strong advocate for the US to fulfill its own disarmament commitments, which it has not. I would say yes. I mean, ideally, we would like to see all nuclear armed states join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which very recently entered into force and we're all very happy about. And I would also add, just for everyone's awareness, that in October of 2016, North Korea did vote in the First Committee of the UN General Assembly in favor of a draft resolution that would have established the formal mandate for states to begin negotiations on the instrument that became the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Of course, they are not signatory to it now. I just want to go back and make sure that we're very clear-eyed that when we talk about denuclearization efforts on the Korean Peninsula, that we also recognize that the United States is also a part of this crisis, that it's also predicated on the US nuclear posture in the region. And we cannot negotiate in good faith with one another when we are enemies, literal enemies. So at a minimum, this is why I think a peace agreement is so important, to help us establish relations that would allow us to engage with one another the way that the US is able to do with other countries like India, Pakistan, Israel, who all have nuclear weapons but are not party to the NPT.
And I see Andrew Simon has another question that I can read, Andrew, if you like, or you could come in. I'll read it. Christine mentioned to me in Hanoi that there was congressional support for an end to the Korean War. Obviously, the Hanoi summit imploded, so I guess there was no movement subsequently. But now with a new administration in situ, are you seeing any groundswell of support in the House for your approach? That is an end of war initiative. Christine, would you like to take that on?
Sure. So that resolution, House Resolution 152, calling for an end to the Korean War, was introduced by Ro Khanna, and that was in 2019, actually, right before the Hanoi summit. And in that period, in the last 2 years, and then I really think about how long I've been doing this work, and actually on the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, where Korean Americans organized a congressional briefing in Washington, D.C. We could only get 2 members of Congress to support peace with North Korea, much less a peace agreement to formally conclude it. And so it's quite significant to us to witness the transformation among members of Congress, where that bill actually garnered 52 co-sponsors of that resolution, including the first Republican. And so from our conversations that we've had with members of Congress, including we received several endorsing quotes of the new report from Korea Peace Champions, Barbara Lee, Ilhan Omar, Jan Schakowsky, and several others, including the new representative from Seattle, among the first Korean American women members of Congress, Marilyn Strickland, about the need to end the Korean War. And so we are optimistic that a new bipartisan resolution will be introduced, as well as a bicameral one. And so we are really going to push, and we feel that a Democratic Congress is just the push that the Biden administration needs, because it is, the arm of government that represents the will of the people. And as we've seen in past, that, oftentimes when we think about, for example, the agreed framework, where the Clinton administration was able to negotiate, an agreement with North Korea to only face a Republican Congress that wanted to quash the actual mechanics of that agreement going forward. So the stars are aligned, and that is why our report is so crucial at this juncture, to make it clear that really the only path forward, the new path forward for the Biden administration, is peace.
And I think that's a very nice note to end this on, Christine. And perhaps may I turn it back to you?
Yes, well, Charles, thank you for being with us, moderating this really thoughtful, thought-provoking press conference, and for the journalists to join us. And I think that concludes our press conference for today.